So relativistic ramming, another voice interjected. I shook my head. We thought about that. It would have to be busters or something that could be directed, and even so you'd have to launch weeks before the encounter, and you'd have to plan it to intercept the enemy at the right place and the right time. Chances of getting it right are too low. Plus, they'll see the approach from a light hour out with Sudar, and they just have to dodge. The busters would have a ridiculous TOW and wouldn't be able to react quickly enough. If we forget about relativistic speeds and just stick to our normal ramming, they won't even feel it. Or they'll just zap ship busters a couple of dozen at a time with those big zappers. There was a short silence as everyone digested this. We knocked around the weapons issue for a while, but soon realized we were all rehashing the same information. I ended the meeting, and we broke into groups. Technically, this was the social part of the get-together, but we've always been a workaholic. Each small crowd turned into a single-issue discussion group. In one group, Jacques was doing an informal presentation on the PAV. I found Bob 1, that is, in the audience. I stepped up beside him. He nodded an acknowledgement and turned back to the presentation. I wanted to say something to him about the Deltans, to commiserate or express sympathy, see how he was doing. Something. He was effectively banished from their society. He'd pretty much adopted the tribe as his family, and to be cast out like that couldn't be easy. But, we are Bob, smart, driven, and socially inept. I focused my attention on the presentation. The PAV seemed, in many ways, to be very human. Okay, they were furry, they had group marriages, and ran around on all fours, but other than that, the PAV tended to a sort of natural socialism. They had social institutions for the less fortunate, but those seemed to be supported by private funding. And well supported, too. PAV governments, even the types that on Earth would have been heavily interventionist, tended to be lean and hands-off. On the other hand, the PAV were, by human standards, about as organized as a basket of puppies. I wondered what effect introducing Robert's Rules of Order would have on them. Jacques finished his presentation, got a round of applause, then the questions started. I grinned, nodded to Bob, and wandered off. So many Bobs. So much intelligence in this room, if I did say so myself. So much control of resources spread over a sphere that might be approaching 100 light years in diameter. And we couldn't pin together a plan to protect a single planet. With a grimace of self-loathing, I popped back to my own VR. 65. Grandpa. Bob. January 2195, Delta Eridani. Archimedes hovered like a nervous father as Belinda cleaned up her new pup. Buster smiled at him, but I could see an edge of irritation as well. It's the sacred duty of every parent to drive their kids crazy, especially when they become grandparents. I grinned at the thought of my mother and father as grandparents, doing their best to make Andrea and Elena insane. Then I had to wipe my eyes as the thought brought back a cascade of family memories. A quick frame jack allowed me to get it together without missing anything. Belinda handed the pup to her mother-in-law and started cleaning herself. Diana rocked the baby for a few moments, very likely another universal, then smiled at Archimedes. It was a picture postcard moment, if you could ignore the bat ears and pig snouts and fur. And I wanted more than anything I'd wanted in a long time to be able to share in it. Archimedes and Buster would have been fine, but Diana would go screeching to the elders at the first sign of a drone. Damn, I disliked her. In his 40s now, Archimedes still showed exceptional good health. He was, of course, the first generation of Deltans to grow up with the improved nutrition that the Bob's inventions had brought to the tribe, but even so, he seemed to be aging slowly for a Deltan. I thought of pestering Bill again about the androids, but he had so many projects on the go, not the least of which was the terraforming of Ragnarok. Bill was good-natured about it, but I had to believe that I was being a bit of a pain. Just the same, he said he was close, a decade or two at most. It just wasn't a priority. I suppose I could offer to help out, but realistically the Deltans and the armaments project still occupied most of my time. And anyway, no one likes a kibitzer. I pulled out of the surveillance drone and picked another that was spying on Caerleon, the new Delton village. Caerleon was situated in another of the old abandoned village sites. Not surprising, since whatever made it a good location the first time would still hold true. With the reduction in gorilloid populations and alteration in gorilloid behavior, the village was a good deal safer now. I smiled sadly at the thought. That was the result of my efforts, and they couldn't take that away from me. Caerleon sat at the top of a rise, barely classifiable as a hill, but the thin soil prevented trees from growing there, resulting in a nice, open space, good for living and easy to defend. I found myself constantly worried, though, about relations between Caerleon and Camelot. The establishment of the second village had been peaceful in that no one got stabbed on the way out, but the acrimony had been strong and tensions still ran high between the two villages. It boggled my mind that so soon after almost becoming extinct, the Deltons had managed to develop into some kind of Cold War mentality. The real problem seemed to be that most of the residents of Caerleon were in the adolescent age range and apparently felt a need to prove something. The antagonism of the Caerleon Deltons concerned me enough, in fact, that I'd set up a surveillance system that would warn me if a significant number of them started a march on Camelot. I was probably just being paranoid, though. I hoped. 66. It's happening. Bill, January 2208, Epsilon Eridani.
Others convoy detected.
Not good. This was probably it. The others would be heading for Gamma Pavonis to strip it down, leaving a dead planet and an empty system. Okay, Guppy, details?
Convoy is twice the size of the GL-54 convoy. Projected destination is Delta Pavonis.
Delta Pavonis? That can't be right. Confirm that, please, Guppy.
Convoy trajectory is pointed directly at Delta Pavonis. Barring an unexpected course correction, certainty is 100%.
Son of a bitch, the Pav. I sent a quick email to Jacques in Delta Pavonis and Claude in Gamma Pavonis explaining the situation. I followed up with messages to Oliver and Mario. Everyone else would get the announcement on the current events RSS feed. Within seconds, several people popped into my VR. This is not according to plan, Claude said. Jacques shrugged. I mentioned this possibility at a mood a while back. Delta is a richer target. A couple of extra years may be a small price to pay for double the payoff, and they know it, seeing the size of the convoy they're sending. Any chance that's because of us? Not a chance, Claude, I said. They don't know we're in that system in the first place, and anyway, it's not like we've done more than buzz around them like a gnat. We are irrelevant. And we will be assimilated. Oliver gave us a lopsided grin. We all chuckled dutifully at the attempt at levity more than anything. Getting down to business, how is our troop build-up? I looked at each person in turn. Jacques spoke first. I've got 20 dreadnoughts, each of which has 5 fission bombs and the usual complement of busters for defense. I've been working on some fusion bombs, but haven't gotten them far enough along, and now we're out of time. Claude jumped in as soon as Jacques was done. I've got 15 dreadnoughts, but I've managed to make a total of 6 fusion bombs to replace some of the fission weapons. I looked at Oliver, who shrugged. I'm building like crazy, old man, but I'm too far away to do any good. I'll send out what I have, and maybe they'll be useful for when the others hit Gamma, assuming they go there next. I looked around at everyone, then shook my head. Another year or two, and we'd have had the cloaking cracked, I'm sure of it. As it is, do what you can. We'll have a mood over the next couple of days, but other than moral support, you guys are on your own. The moot was held within a day. It was a somber affair. When I ascended the podium, all conversation ceased. No air horn, no booze. A sea of faces looked back at me, all wearing the same downcast expression. You all know the situation. Anyone have any ideas? I don't suppose your asteroid mover could move, Pav. I looked at Thor. It probably hadn't been a serious suggestion. Sorry, buddy. In theory, the system can move anything, but right now I'd have trouble getting something the size of a planet to budge. Maybe someday, if we don't mind the inhabitants freezing to death about midway through the move. I nodded at Ben, one of the new batch of dreadnoughts. True, the trip would still take a year or two subjective, and all that time spent without a sun. No bueno for sure. I think we're stuck with the situation as it is. It's going to come down to a toe-to-toe punch-up, and unfortunately, before we're ready. The only advantage we have is that we know it's going to happen, and they don't. I looked over my reports. Claude had launched all of his new dreadnoughts to Delta Pavonis. With their better acceleration, they'd arrive before the others, but only just barely. Any strategies would have to be worked out while they were in transit. Between Claude's group and Jacques, we had 35 dreadnoughts. Jacques would probably get that total up to about 60 by the time Claude's group arrived. It sounded like a lot until you looked at the size of the others' force. 20 death asteroids, 40 cargo vessels, and several hundred attendants. The attendants could be considered equivalent to busters. They were almost certainly Amy-controlled and could be depended upon to ram an enemy if required. The cargo vessels would be difficult to destroy simply because of their size, but I didn't expect a lot of offensive capability there. The death asteroids would be the big unknown. We were pretty confident that we could withstand their death rays, but we really didn't know what other weaponry they might have in reserve. It was a safe bet that the others had thought of the possibility of running into another species capable of fighting back. I mentioned this to Garfield and was surprised when he didn't agree with me. I think we've visited pretty much every system that the others have been to, Bill. He waved a hand casually at the star map he'd popped up. And they haven't run into anything like that, so they've never had their butts kicked. Even when we've run up against them, the worst we've done is blow ourselves up. They're arrogant. Borg-level arrogant, and maybe even beyond. We're not even assimilation targets to them. We're just food. I thought about this. So you think they may be overconfident? I grinned. Or maybe just appropriately confident. Garfield responded with a rueful chuckle. Yeah, whatever. The point is, though, they may not have a plan B. 67. Bad news. Howard, December 2210, HIP 14101. HIP 14101 was a bit of a bust. Nice sun, nice spectral lines, but nothing orbiting it worth talking about. A Jovian had managed to set up shop at the outer edge of the comfort zone, leaving no space for any terrestroid planets. I was having a good time investigating it, though. According to Wikibob, no one had yet given a gas giant anything more than the standard cursory once-over. Okay, granted, they're hard to colonize, but still. Adapting the drones to operate inside the atmosphere of the Jovian was a constant headache, a game of whack-a-mole, as original Bob would have said. I would get a little deeper in with each new prototype, but I was losing about 1 in 3. But there was lots of metal in this system, and I had all the time in the world. I was relaxing out on the patio when a ding indicated an incoming message. I popped it up and started to read. It was another update from Dexter. More about the colonies, several new cities, population up over 1 million, space industries, yada yada. Oh. Stefan was dying. Halliburton's encephalopathy had been identified within a decade of landing on Vulcan and appeared to be one of the few diseases that found Terran life compatible. There was no treatment yet, and it was fatal within 6 months. I felt my stomach drop away. Stefan had been my friend for a long time, and the thing with Bridget hadn't changed that. Not really. But it reminded me that I called humans ephemerals for a reason. I'd been lounging around in this system for too long. First, I wrote an email to Bridget and Stefan and asked when I could arrange a call. Then, there would be other calls to make. I pinged Bill, then popped in when I got an acknowledgement. Garfield was there as well, sitting and drinking a coffee. Diagrams and notes covered all the walls. Just your basic normal mad scientist lab. Both of them looked down in the dumps. All the Bobs were preparing for the others' arrival in Delta Pavonis. Bill and Garfield no doubt felt pressure to produce new weapons, but you could only do what you could do. Well, I sympathized, but I had immediate concerns. "Hey guys," I said, motioning to the decorations. "What's the project?" "Couple of different ones," Garfield answered. "But most of this wall is the android project. That's what you called it, about right?" I nodded and examined my shoes for a few moments before looking up. "How close are you guys to a more or less human equivalent android? I'm going to have a funeral to attend soon." Bill and Garfield looked at each other, then back at me. "Pretty far along, actually. We've got a prototype. It looks like a mannequin, and you wouldn't want to go dancing, but for walking around, I think it's ready." "Could I make one in 3 months?" Bill thought for a few moments. "Right now it's all prototypes and one-offs with manual assembly. We'd have to put together formal printer plans. But once we have those done, yes." I nodded. It would be in time. You never knew for sure with medical predictions, of course, but one could hope. "Send the plans to Dexter at Vulcan when they're ready, okay?" I'd received an email from Dexter that the android was ready. It was time to arrange a visit. I took a deep breath and placed a phone call. After a few rings, Bridget answered the phone. "Howard?" "Hi, Bridge. How's Stefan doing?" Bridget hesitated. She looked terrible. Stefan's illness was taking its toll on her as well. Her eyes were red. Her hair was gray. Her skin was gray. I wanted to take her in my arms and make it all go away, and I realized with a start, this was the first time that I had articulated my feelings about her so clearly. "Stefan won't last much longer. Another couple of weeks is the most the doctors will commit to." "I'm so sorry, Bridget. How's he taking it?" "He's mostly not lucid anymore, Howard. We knew that was coming, and we said our goodbyes." She blinked back tears as she spoke. Brave words, but the pain behind them shone through. I endured a momentary wave of grief as I realized I wouldn't be able to say goodbye to my friend. I looked at Bridget without saying anything, and she nodded, understanding completely. I tried to say the usual inane words of encouragement. I would have stayed on the line as long as she wanted, but she was tired, physically and emotionally, and she soon begged off. I hung up the phone and put my face in my hands. It took several milliseconds to get myself under control. Then I pinged Dexter. "Hi, Howard. Checking up on Manny?" "Yep." I looked around Dexter's VR. It was a basic library sort of thing. I'd begun to notice less and less effort by the Bobs, especially the later generations, to put together an interesting VR. I made a mental note to discuss the shift in attitudes with Dexter if the opportunity ever came up. He nodded and popped up a video and some report summaries. The video showed Manny the android in his support cradle. He looked complete. I leaned forward and looked closely at the summary windows. "All tests completed successfully," Dexter said. "I figured you'd want to do the first activation." "Thanks, Dex." Bill's Android project had been going on and off for 65 years now, and this was the latest version. Manny consisted of a carbon fiber matrix skeleton, designed and articulated to replicate the human version as closely as possible. Memory plastics that contracted when a voltage was applied stood in for muscles. The artificial musculature was laid down over the skeleton in the same layout as human musculature. The result was something that should be able to move, behave, and appear realistic. And neural feedback from the android would ensure a realistic experience for the operator. Unfortunately, human-appearing skin and hair were low on the priority list. Right now, Manny did indeed resemble a mannequin more than anything else. No hair, pale plastic texture skin, and gray, staring eyes. According to the specs, facial muscle control was still a little spotty. I had a quick glance at the deficiencies list. Well, Bill had said it was a prototype. 68. Recording. Jacques, September 2212, Delta Pavonis. Guppy popped into VR.
New memory core is online.
Good, it was getting a little tight. Have the drones resume the full program. Guppy nodded and disappeared. I had implemented a plan to record as much of the planet as I could before the others got here. Not just PAV civilization either. Plants, animals, scenery, geology, anything and everything I could think of. I built a standalone set of stasis chambers well in advance of the colony ships, and now I was slowly stocking it with genetic material from every species that I could get a needle into. A very informal and ad hoc genetic diversity vault, in essence. I had no overall organization, as I'd had no time to catalog and categorize the life on Delta Pavonis 4 into any kind of system. I was, in effect, stealing a strategy from Noah and treating everything as a kind. The recordings would help with identifying species and such later, if there was a later. I was also recording PAV societies, cultures, and languages. Between all the spying and recording, my data storage requirements were massive. Guppy had just done the third upgrade since I'd started the project. I estimated there was at least one more upgrade coming. I had played with the idea of contacting some PAV on the sly, perhaps to get a personal account of life, but Bill had convinced me that it would be cruel at best and at worst, ghoulish. Instead, I operated as a passive observer. Our technology was much better than the Victorian-era PAV sciences, but even so, things didn't always go perfectly. There'd been a couple of sightings, and PAV Society now had their own version of conspiracy theorists and flying saucer nuts. It made me wonder if the human equivalents had been based on some kind of reality. I tried to imagine some alien version of replicants hanging around Earth and kidnapping people. No. Especially with the anal probe thing. Just no. Since the plan involved kidnapping 20,000 PAV, I wanted to have a pre-selected target group. Running around grabbing people until I hit my quota just didn't strike me as efficient. I spent some time doing a census of small towns until I had found 2 that came in just under 10,000 souls each. I could, if necessary, top up the numbers from what appeared to be nearby military bases. The 2 towns, Miershkva and Izilkva, were like small-town USA, rural, residential, stable population, family-oriented. I wanted to document and understand PAV society at the grassroots level. On the other hand, I didn't want to go down the road of Bob 1 and end up getting attached to individuals. I had a bad feeling, though, that we Bobs had a shared weakness of some kind, some need for attachment. It would require a delicate balancing act. I picked a house at random in the town of Mierchkva and set up surveillance. Gnat-sized roamers installed cameras and microphones in the house. I felt dirty, like some kind of voyeur, but reminded myself that I was preserving the record of a culture that would likely not exist in another decade. The Los family group seemed fairly average, as PAV families went. 6 adults split evenly between the genders, plus 9 children at various ages. The PAV didn't have a large need for privacy, so bedroom organization was based mostly on available space. Furniture tended to move around on a daily basis, depending on mood.
Meals were held at specific times, simply because of the logistics of preparing food for that many people, but there was no organization that I could see.
My best metaphor was a birthday party attended by 2-year-olds, a total free-for-all. The adults held an assortment of jobs. The PAV didn't seem to care about stratification of social classes. The matriarch of the house, Da Hazjarlos, was on Merkva's town council. She seemed intelligent and, for a PAV, very level-headed. I made a point of tagging her for special handling, if and when. I settled in for some long-term spying on people's lives. 69. Wake. Howard, January 2211, Vulcan. Okay, here goes. This was the 3rd time I'd said that, but I still hadn't opened the cargo bay door. Stage fright for sure. Manny would never be mistaken for human. He was a giant step down from Mr. Data, in fact, but I had told Bridget I would be there, and I was going to keep my promise. I took a deep breath. Manny performed the motion, not that he needed oxygen, and commanded the door to open. I stepped out and looked around. I had landed the cargo drone in the parking lot of the funeral home. A small crowd of people was gathered in front of the building entrance, watching. I guess they'd been waiting for me. I activated magnification for a moment and recognized several people, including Butterworth. I walked toward the group, concentrating on not falling flat on my face. I'd practiced beforehand, but this was my first physical public appearance in almost 200 years. Nervous didn't even begin to cover it. Butterworth nodded to me.
Not bad, Howard. I'm sure you'll continue to improve the product.
I nodded back. There wasn't enough facial control to smile yet, and I didn't trust my voice right at that moment. We stepped into the building where Bridget was waiting. She smiled, and my heart was almost wrenched out of my chest at the sadness there. She'd been with Stefan for 18 years. She stepped up to me and said,
Howard, I'm glad you came. Can I hug you?
Yes, of course. Manny has full sensory input. It'll be my first real hug since I, died. Wow, almost a total foot-in-mouth moment. Since I became a replicant. She wrapped her arms around me and hugged. And I could feel every bit of it. From her head against my cheek, to her breasts against my chest, to her arms around my back. The moment lasted an eternity and a fraction of a second. Bridget stepped back and looked into my eyes, and I tried to re-engage my brain. I finally managed, "It's good to see you." A small panicked corner of my mind wondered if Manny had faithfully rendered my imitation of a fish trying to breathe. I hoped not. I looked towards the coffin. I guess replication wasn't an option.
Catholic, remember?
Bridget gave me a wan smile.
I don't think the Archbishop would approve.
I wanted to ask if she would reconsider it for herself, but this wasn't the time or place. This was the memorial. The funeral mass had already been held, and I hadn't actually forgotten that Stefan was Catholic. I would have been a distraction, to put it mildly. Bridget had been careful with who she invited to this event to prevent any kind of awkwardness with yours truly. We stood around and talked, compared memories. I met Bridget's children, Rosie, Leanne, and Howard, who answered to Howie. He would have just turned 13 by the old Earth calendar and seemed uncomfortable with his height, as if he'd just been through a growth spurt. Howie bombarded me with questions while the two girls stood behind him and looked on with wide eyes. Turned out Stefan had told stories about me. I told Howie a few stories about his father. As I did, memories of our early days on Vulcan flooded back. Stefan had always accepted me as just a guy he talked to on the phone a lot. There'd never been any awkwardness, any reserve. It hit me that he was the best friend I'd had since well before I died. I scheduled a good cry for later when I was alone. Bridget came over to stand beside me, a plate of food in her hand. I looked down at it, the usual mix of hors d'oeuvres, meat slices, and crackers. Bridget saw my glance and asked, "Can you eat?" "Not yet. Bill's going to engineer Manny to be as human-like as possible, eventually. He's been distracted with the others thing, though. I'll eat something in VR. Bridget looked at her children, at her plate, everywhere but at me. I knew the conversation we'd had before I left Vulcan was still hanging there between us. I sighed and experienced a moment of panic when I realized that the sigh was audible.
We'll talk some other time. You're not leaving right after the memorial, are you?
Bridget had a small smile on her face. Well, physically, I'm about 19 light years away, Bridget. Scout remote capability is making distance mostly irrelevant. Manny will go into storage when I'm done with him, so there's no leaving as such. I'll always be around, whether by phone or in person, so to speak. I looked around. The two girls had wandered off, but Howie was glued to our conversation. How'd it go? Bill's posture reminded me of Bridget, the day we introduced our product to Butterworth. I guess I should have expected it. This was a potentially watershed moment for the Bobs. Real physical contact would change all of our interactions. Bill and Garfield had both popped in as soon as I came back to VR. Dexter was there as Resident Bob, and Bob 1 had shown up as well. I gathered from conversation that he'd been harassing Bill for years about the androids. It worked, I said. It was a controlled environment, and everyone there was expecting me, of course. I don't know about going out in public. But it's a start, and a successful one. Bob was nodding his head repeatedly. I wondered for a second if his avatar had gotten stuck in a loop, but no, that was just excitement. I accepted the inevitable and settled into my chair for the debriefing. But how did it feel? Bill fairly glared at me with the intensity of his question. I had a momentary image of him reaching down my throat and ripping the answer out of me. I snickered, which got me a couple of concerned looks. Compared to VR? I looked up for a moment, organizing my thoughts. It's an order of magnitude more real. I don't know how much of that is psychological, just from knowing that it is real, but I think the VR only provides the sensations we've programmed it to provide, while Manny gives us everything, expected or not, relevant or not, and not under our control. Think of it as the difference between trying to tickle yourself versus being tickled by someone else. It's an entirely different, far more intense experience. Yeah, Bill responded. I tried to get some of that back with the baseball games, but I think it still falls short. Don't get me wrong, Bill. It's not like I expect us to all fall over and go crackers. The VR saved Bob 1, and it saved all of us. We all agree on that. I shrugged. But it's not the full-on experience. We've forgotten what that's like. Today just reminded me. I looked at Bob, who had finally gotten the head bobbing under control, but was now bouncing on his toes. An arched eyebrow made him blush and stop the motion. I think the android project should be bumped up in priority, Bob said. Bill rolled his eyes. There's a surprise. You willing to help? You have the free time, right? Bob looked abashed, and Bill winced at the unintentional cheap shot. Sorry, buddy. Didn't mean that the way it came out. Bob shrugged. I get it. And yeah, I do have a lot of free time these days. Maybe this will help. Bill popped up the project notes and schematics, probably rushing to change the subject. Garfield moved in, and the conversation went all technoid. I sighed, stood and waved to everyone, then popped back to my VR. I had some thinking of my own to do. 70. Conversation. Howard, May 2211, HIP 14101. Bridget's voice sounded tired. She was looking better, though, at least over the phone. Her color was coming back. She was starting to take care of herself again. I ached to say something, to take her hand, I needed to cut off that train of thought. I silently chanted ephemeral a half-dozen times. It didn't help.
But it wouldn't be me, would it, really?
Bridget's image in the video window smiled. Her sad smile was a pale ghost of the high-wattage grin that I remembered from better days. I swallowed and, after a false start or two, replied, That's a philosophical argument that I freely admit I'm not able to be objective about. I'm not original Bob. I'm not even Bob 1, or Will, or Charles. But I'm me, and I feel just as alive as original Bob did. I stood up and began to pace around my apartment. The image that Bridget's phone displayed to her would, of course, stay centered on me. It would be you in very real ways, Bridget. I don't know from souls, but in every other way you would live on.
I mentioned the idea casually,
Bridget said after a moment of silence.
The girls looked horrified. Even Howie looked unsure. And you know he's all about you and the other Bobs.
I smiled in response. Bridget's son was certainly my biggest fan. I hesitated before continuing. Look, Bridget, it's not like any decision is irrevocable, except the one that's in force, if and when. I checked with Benning. All you need to do is have her record a video call where you state your wishes. It counts as a codicil. You can record a new one any time.
I know, Howard. And for the moment, at least, I'll have to pass.
I sighed, defeated. Okay, Bridget. But I'm still going to build the equipment. At least we don't have to behead and freeze you nowadays. The stasis pods will do a much better job of preservation. And the scanners are pretty straightforward. Plus, it's not necessarily just you. We could... I stopped abruptly as a thought hit me. I cued it for consideration after the call. Bridget looked at me with an arched eyebrow, but I didn't explain, so she dropped it.
I hope you won't be upset at me for this, Howard. I still want you to visit now.
Of course not. It's your decision, Bridget, and I'll respect that. And yes, I'll visit when I can. I gave her an apologetic shrug. Manny is getting a makeover right now. Bob 1 is insanely OCD when he's motivated, no surprise to anyone, and he's been improving the android tech at a furious pace. I chuckled. Bill admitted to me that he's a bit embarrassed. He worked on the project for decades, and Bob's leaving him in the dust in a time span of months.
So, Manny will be a little more human next time I see you?
Actually, Manny will look like original Bob, from what I'm told. Believable hair and skin, and so forth. And he'll be able to eat, although he won't...
Never mind. TMI, she really didn't need to know the ultimate fate of the meal.
Bridget laughed. She knew exactly where my mind had gone. Just one of the many things I loved about her.
So we can finally have dinner together.
I smiled and nodded. Finally. A real date. Butterworth? Bill stared at me, eyebrows climbing his forehead. Well, granted, Riker will probably have a cow, which will be ironic, but Butterworth has got to be in his 80s now, if not more. The guy's like an Egyptian mummy. He just gets drier and more leathery. Maybe he's a pack protector? Bill grinned at me. I rolled my eyes. Honestly, sometimes the early generation Bobs were a bit weird. Yeah, anyway, he's military, or ex-military, whatever. Maybe he can help with the war. Interesting thought, Howard. I'm not against it by any means. We should run it through a moot before bringing it up with Butterworth, though. I nodded, unfazed. Moots were held weekly these days, because of the others' threat. I wouldn't have to wait long. I'd never seen Butterworth actually speechless before. I'd seen him trying not to explode. I'd seen him explode. I'd listened to him explode. This was new. Butterworth stared into the video window, his jaw hanging slightly open. Finally, he found his voice.
You want to replicate me?
Well, eventually, not like this week. The process can't be done on a living person, not if you want to be left with a living person afterwards. But I'm building the equipment for any such circumstance, and it occurred to me that you would be valuable for the war effort. Butterworth looked down at his desk in silence. Then he looked up and smiled.
Sure, why not?
Well, that was easy. Okay, I'll send you a file with some information. You'll need to update your will. Butterworth nodded and ended the call. 71. Charlie. Bob, June 2213, Delta Eridani. Charlie hung in the rack, powered down and looking boneless. The Deltan android looked utterly convincing. I had put a lot of effort into getting the fur right, both in texture and layout. I didn't want Charlie to come across like all the bad ape and werewolf costumes from 20th century movies. This needed to be believable. I realized that I was stalling. The android had been checked out every which way, and it was now time to put up or shut up. Sighing, I ordered the cargo drone to open the hangar door while I activated Charlie. I turned my head and looked out the cargo bay doors. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the bright daylight outside. I undraped myself from the support rack and, staggering a little, walked to the doors. I stood for a moment looking around at the forest. I'd seen all of this many times, of course, from the various drones, but there was something viscerally different this time. I was here in some undefinable way. It might be as simple as the feeling of the breeze lightly ruffling my fur, or the smell of the damp leaf layer that formed the floor of the forest. I spared a moment to grin with unconstrained joy, which the autonomic interface converted to a spread-eared, wide-eyed expression appropriate to a Deltan. Stepping out onto the surface of Eden, I looked down at the ground, feeling the slightly slimy texture as the decaying leaf fragments squished between my clawed toes. Dappled sunlight flickered as the tree branches and leaves moved in the breeze. With an effort, I brought myself back on task. I triggered the heads-up display and pulled up a local map. The image hovering in my line of sight showed my location and the location of Archimedes relative to me. I turned to line him up and began to walk. I spotted Archimedes through the underbrush, the observation drone hovering near his shoulder. He casually worked a small flint core as he waited. It appeared I was far more nervous about this meeting than he was, or maybe that was his way of coping. Well, whatever. Showtime. I walked towards him and said his name as soon as I was within conversational distance. He looked up, and his eyes went wide. Springing to his feet, he squeaked, "Bob!" I grinned at him as I approached. I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped in surprise when he jerked back and exclaimed, "Woof! Wow!" "Problem?" "Sorry, Bob. You smell. Kind of like the drones, especially when a new one is delivered, and also a bit like the ashes from a cold fire. You definitely won't fool anyone." "Oh, crap!" I rolled my eyes in frustration. I didn't think of that. Deltans depend much more on the sense of smell than humans do. Is it really bad? "Not as long as I'm upwind, no." He grinned at me. "Gotcha. Okay, I'll go to work on it. How about the rest? Does it look okay?" Archimedes cocked his head one way, then the other. "You move in a sort of jerky way, like a pup when he's learning to walk. But maybe that'll go away. What's more weird is that your fur pattern is exactly the same on both sides of your body. No one is like that. It stands out." Of course, I'd made Charlie completely symmetrical. I would have to fix that. And the odor. I needed to smell like a Deltan, and more importantly, like an individual. I took a deep lungful of Archimedes, cataloging his odor and the lingering essence of what had to be Diana. It wasn't insurmountable, thank the universe, just chemistry. "Got it. Okay, Archimedes, I'll go away and fix this stuff. I can see you trying to stay upwind of me, even though you're being polite about it," I chuckled. Having been downwind of a couple of people who needed showers in a former life, I can relate. Archimedes looked slightly confused, but nodded. I waved goodbye and turned to walk back to the cargo drone. Charlie the android. Take 2. I walked up to Archimedes and spread my arms, palms forward in a "well" gesture. He took a deep sniff, cocked his head, and nodded. "You're walking better, as well. I guess that's just practice, like with children. And your fur pattern is better. It's very simple, but I know a few people like that. You'll just be forgettable." He grinned at me. I laughed in response. "Well, that's fine. The last thing I want is to attract attention. Now, will I be questioned if I enter Camelot?" "No, I don't think so." Archimedes turned and gestured towards the village, and we began walking. I silently ordered the drone to return to standby. "Camelot is so big now," he continued, "and Caerleon is growing as well, even with the tension between us and them. A certain number of people still move back and forth. It's not like there are rules about it." He gave me a sideways glance and a knowing grin. I pantomimed silent laughter at him. Archimedes and I had talked about many things over the decades. I think he now understood that I wasn't some kind of supernatural being, just someone with more knowledge than him. In a society where very little changed from generation to generation, it was easy to think of the way things are as some kind of natural state, but Archimedes had seen enough new knowledge in his lifetime to understand that when you went from not knowing something to knowing something, it changed the way you lived. With the loss of that awe had come a much deeper friendship and a better understanding between us. Archimedes thought a lot of the things humans took for granted were hilarious, like the idea of rules for everything. Deltans simply wouldn't stand for such regimentation of their lives. I found myself coming around to his point of view more and more. In short order, we arrived at Camelot. With an effort of will, I suppressed the Monty Python skit from my mind. As we walked across the land bridge, I looked ahead at the village proper. It was a sea of Deltans, in groups around the central fires, and smaller groups around, and smaller groups around, and smaller groups around, and smaller groups around, and smaller groups around.